Hi everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. Here with us today we have Dr. April Bleske Rechek. She is a professor of psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, and as a researcher she focuses on human mating, friendship, cognitive abilities and intellectual giftedness, and science literacy, and today we'll be focusing on particularly human mating and friendship. Dr. Bleske Rechek, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. We talked a little bit before, and I guess that with you, first of all, and before getting into friendship and all of those things, I would like to ask you to please give us a personal account of yours about the first contact you had with evolutionary psychology, because as far as I understood it, you had contact with the discipline when it was still in a very precocious phase, right? And you
Right.
even worked under great people like David Leake and David Buss, David Lubinsky, and people like that. So could you please talk a little bit about that, and also about what you deem to be the importance that the development of evolutionary psychology had for psychology in general?
Okay. Wow. So maybe to hit the latter point first, right? I
Okay.
think it's been a tremendous paradigm shift. It's just tremendous what we have with evolutionary psychology. And sometimes I'm still surprised when I come across people who have no idea about evolution and why it would be relevant for humans. But that's just a new battle, right, to struggle with. But yeah, I think in terms of my history or my personal development, I think that as the years go on, the weight kind of increases in terms of my knowledge of like how awesome my mentors were. As a 17-year-old, I volunteered at the Minnesota Twin Registry and worked in David Licken's office, helping him file papers. And he was just an amazing man. And then so I was already interested in twins. I was always interested in behavior genetics and the logic of twin and adoption studies. And when I went off to college, my honors mentor was Ashalom Caspi and his wife Terry Moffat. And hence I was already interested in romantic attachment and mating type stuff. And we looked at assortative mating. And they were tremendous. They were amazingly generous with their time with me, little peon undergrad. And they were busy going off to New Zealand and collecting longitudinal data all the time, and just tremendous. And then while I was there at Madison, Ashalom Caspi invited David Buss to give a talk. And I must have been in my senior year at this time, because my junior year I studied abroad in Madrid. And so David gave a talk, and it must have been early that year. And he was currently at the University of Michigan. And he came into Madison and gave a talk, and he was talking about jealousy and sexual strategies. And I was like, whoa, everything became crystal clear. And so I went to the reception and asked him questions and ended up applying to go to the University of Michigan. And he at the time was being courted to move to the University of Texas at Austin. And so it just so happened that he and I both started at the University of Texas at Austin the next year. He, of course, as a well-paid professor, and I as a graduate student. And so I really didn't even know what I was going into. All I knew was that I was studying with David Buss. It was my dream. I remember the first book I got. I think it was Matt Ridley's The Red Queen, and I was like, whoa, this is what we're doing. Okay, and it was great. And so I really think I didn't even really know what evolutionary psychology was, but I was there at the beginning and hearing about conversations that David was having with Donald Simons and Lita and John. And others, and it was fascinating, right? And it's not until after that you can really appreciate how tremendous it actually is to be there in all the action. And of course, I was surrounded by graduate students like Todd Shackelford and Marty Hazelton, and I was right after David Schmidt and all these people who had done this super amazing stuff, right? And paved the way for me to hopefully make, whatever additions I could. So it was pretty cool to have those mentors. Oh, and in graduate school too, I worked with Joe Horn and Lee Willerman, who are also behavioral geneticists. And then with David and Joe Horn, I got kind of hooked up with David Lubinsky at Vanderbilt University and worked with David and Camilla. And they were tremendous mentors as well. And David Lubinsky his depth of knowledge is absolutely unsurpassable. I mean, he is really tremendous. So I learned a lot from him. I only had 2 years there, but I think I gained, I like to think much more than that in my time with him.
Well, what an amazing story you have there.
Yeah.
With such great names. And by the way, for people who will be watching this, I will have in the near future Dr. David Buss on the channel. So just for you to know. Okay, so let's start now with friendship. So we have same-sex friendship and cross-sex or opposite-sex friendship, right? First of all, why is it important to study and understand the dynamics of human friendship in these two different ways, and not simply study human friendship in general from an evolutionary perspective?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. I think David and I were both really interested in friendship because it was one of those relationships where you have this mutual, voluntary cooperation, and you don't have genetic commonality, not in the sense of being family members or, and you're not reproductive partners. And so it was one of those nice components. And of course, other people in the lab at the time were interested in things like homicide, and I wasn't really going that direction. I was interested in cooperative relationships. I was interested in opposite sex friendship initially. And the fact that you said cross-sex, opposite sex, cross-gender, that's been kind of an issue from relatively early on in that research. I had reviewers who would say, well, you should call this other gender friendships. And I was like, well, if I call them other gender friendships, my readers aren't going to know what I'm talking about. Or my participants, for example, they don't call them other gender friends. But that whole, like, what kind of word you should use that is the politically correct version has frustrated me in terms of that research. But when I was early in my graduate school career, I was reading about baboons, and I'm sure that David probably piqued my interest about this. But Barbara Smuts has done some great research with baboons, showing that they have these special friendships, and I was thinking, these sound a lot like friends with benefits. What's going on between male and female baboons, and females would mate with a few different males, and the males that they mated with gave more attention to them and their offspring, and hence this made me think about and hypothesize the ways in which men's and women's evolved mating strategies might actually manifest in the way they think about opposite sex friends. So that's how that all began. And then I remember having a conversation about friendship in general and women and rivalry between women. And David and I were having a conversation. I was telling him about the up-down, that women give each other the up-down. Have you heard of the up-down?
No, I don't think so.
Maybe not, but you have seen it. This is when women look at another woman and they give them the down and up, right? As they quickly scan their face and body, and David had never heard the term. That I don't know if I coined it or who coined it, but I called it the up down, and every female I know is quite familiar with it. And David was like, "Oh, that's fascinating. We have to study that." And of course, then I started really just digging into the friendship literature, what we already had on same-sex friendship and opposite-sex friendship, and they were so domain general. They were not at all informed by evolutionary psychology, obviously at that point, and it was like, well, people figure out who they want to be friends with, and they start a friendship, and then they maintain the friendship, and then sometimes friendships dissolve. And there was this analysis that, people have investments in their friendships, and there's commitment and there's equity, but there wasn't an understanding of what might drive that commitment or what might drive that equity or inequity.
Mm-hmm.
So hence we tried to evolutionize it a bit.
Okay, so would you say that the cues and signals that people attend to on the opposite sex when they are selecting a mate are the ones that are at the basis of same-sex friendship rivalries? So, for example, cues of attractiveness and sexual receptivity in women, and, for example, the ability to generate more resources in men.
Right. So I think I took the hypothesis, or proposed that, at least in heterosexual young women's friendships, that one of the underlying roots of their rivalry and feelings of competition is this is rooted in discrepancies or competition over physical attractiveness, precisely because heterosexual young women compete to embody what men prize. And in a variety of studies, right, we've seen that men, they don't necessarily prioritize physical attractiveness first, but especially when you give them a limited mating budget, or you look at speed dating studies, physical attractiveness takes a lot of priority, whether people admit it or not. It's a first filter, particularly for men. It's not that it's irrelevant for women, but it's certainly more strongly emphasized for men. And so, or men emphasize it more, both whether they're heterosexual or homosexual for that matter. So I brought in female friends in a couple of different studies and asked them questions about themselves and about their friendship. And of course, they did this under the publicly pronounced agreement that they would not be talking about their responses to each other after the study. So I was trying to promote some honesty. And then they were, of course, separated for the study. And in these studies, we also photographed the women and measured their bodies. So we had information about their body shape and their body size. We certainly distinguish between shape and size, right? And then we asked them their perceptions of rivalry in the friendship, and we asked them their perceptions of their own and their friends' attractiveness relative to other people, and their friends' attractiveness relative to themselves. And I think we got some really cool findings from these studies, one being that female friends are similar in those attributes that are relevant for mate search. They're not similar in body size, like how tall they are, but they're similar in their body shape, that is their waist to hip ratio. We documented that twice, and they're also similar in their bra cup size. So women who are small-chested are more likely to be hanging out with other small-chested women, and vice versa. That relationship isn't as strong as body shape, but certainly there, and statistically significant. Female friends are similar in their rated attractiveness, and these are judges who don't know that they're viewing friends, so they're still judged as similarly attractive. We've documented that in a couple of different ways. Like, you can give people a selection of female friends and then have them match them, and they are similar enough based on it. I'm assuming attractiveness. We try to channel it into like, oh, yep, I think it really is attractiveness they're responding to. People can match friends to an above chance degree. And then we documented that women's perceptions. Okay, well, first let me back up and just say that the typical female doesn't perceive herself as the less attractive friend. And this is probably a statistical impossibility, in the sense that you can have two female friends and they both think they're more attractive than the other one. Yeah? So that's kind of interesting in and of itself. But when you do this on a continuum, the more one female friend perceives herself as the less attractive friend, the more mating rivalry she perceives in the friendship. And the mating rivalry items we used did not have anything to do with attractiveness. They were items like, I feel like my friend steals attention from men. I worry that my female friend will will get the same person that I'm interested in, that kind of thing. Or just a blanket item, I feel like I'm in competition with my friend. And what we tried to show was that this was unique to attractiveness, because women's perceptions that their friend was a better athlete than them, that their friend was more intelligent than them, those variables were not associated with their perceptions of mating rivalry in the friendship. It was uniquely related to their perception of their friend as more attractive than they. I think that association could be quite a bit stronger, but we have that qualifier, we have that restriction in the sense that the typical female, when you pit her against her friend, even if she thinks her friend is more attractive than other women, she's typically not going to say that the friend is more attractive than she is. So there's a bit of a self-protective maintenance going on there, is my guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that your studies gave those results about how women tend to match up in terms of friendship with other women of equal or equivalent attractiveness, because it's interesting that I already talked with some women who have the intuition that women would tend to match in terms of friendship with uglier women, because when they went out, for example, when they went to the disco or something like that, and they were trying to get a mate, that the fact they would have an uglier female next to her would work as a sort of contrast.
Right.
to enhance their beauty.
Yeah, you certainly don't want somebody way more attractive than you, right? Because they're gonna draw all the attention away, and of course, you also have to worry about what sexual strategy they are advertising, however ambiguously it might be. But then you also don't want a female who's much less attractive either, because males will just go off in an entirely different direction, especially if that's a powerful first filter. And this is an intriguing question. Like Dan Ariely, in one of his TED Talks, and in Predictably Irrational, he talks about this as well, that, you know, you want a slightly uglier version of yourself with you when you go out, and that's a great way of saying it. I do wonder if the situation is slightly different for men, however, because, you know, men having a slightly uglier version of themselves as opposed to women having a slightly uglier version of themselves. And to the extent that women don't emphasize attractiveness to the same degree that men do, that whole setup could be a little bit different, right? The consequences and implications for men and for women. And I haven't seen anybody study that comparison directly, but it certainly would be interesting, right? In other words, men might be, I don't know. I guess I won't speculate too much, but I do think they're slightly different situations.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And okay, now in the case of opposite sex friendships, do they often fail because men and women end up having different interests when they approach the opposite sex to begin a friendship?
You know, it's interesting because it's hard to track in the long term the percent of friendships that actually fail for those reasons. I would say that when we ask men and women about friendships they're currently involved in and friendships that have dissolved, when you ask them about the friendships that have dissolved, approximately a third will mention something like, well, you know, I wanted to date them and they didn't want to date me, or the reverse. There was sexual tension. Yeah, you know, these are, at least in my studies, the vast majority have been young adults, and so physical relocations are responsible for a lot of modified friendships that just kind of go downhill. But sexual tension and what would we say, non-mutual attraction accounts for quite a few. At the same time, when you ask them about ongoing friendships they currently have, they are just as likely to mention attraction as being a relevant aspect of that friendship as they are to mention it being an aspect of their dissolved friendships. So it could just be happening in ongoing friendships and dissolved friendships, and then you just kind of key into that as a likely cause of the disintegration of the friendship. And I don't feel like I have the longitudinal data to really make the case that it's lack of attraction or attempted involvement and then failure. I just don't have the longitudinal data to make the case. But I certainly would say that attraction, mutual or non-mutual, is quite common between opposite-sex friends. Even our middle-aged adult samples will mention it. And I think that's one of the most striking sex differences that I've documented, that men are more likely than women to mention it as a benefit of the friendship, and women are more likely than men to nominate that attraction as a cost and potential frustration of the friendship.
Mm-hmm. And when the sexes initiate friendships with a particular person of the opposite sex, usually the underlying motivation they have to do so falls under a certain predictable category. That is, for both men and women, they could start a friendship with someone of the opposite sex with the prospect of that turning into a long-term romantic relationship, right?
Well, I don't know if that's their long-term. I don't know if that's their long-term goal or intent or not. I've had some interesting conversations with women in particular, where they'll say, well, my guys they're all just friends. And I'll say, well, have you asked them if they're attracted to you? And then they kind of look off and think, well, I guess I don't know. So they haven't even, some of them haven't even thought about it. And to some degree, we know from a variety of domains of research that men and women can pursue their sexual strategies perhaps more effectively by not being aware of their own intentions. So, maybe there is some underlying motivation, or I guess I would just say that there are evolved mating strategies operating in the background, whether they're aware of it or not. And so the idea is that when you think about, when you interact with somebody who is of reproductive age, not a genetic relative, and is displaying cues of being a reproductively viable or attractive partner, that, logically your mating strategies should be activated. Like, that is a potential mating partner. And your life situation may not call for that at the moment, but that doesn't mean that your mating strategies and your mating mechanisms may not be operating in the background and coloring your interpretation of that person's behaviors and facial expressions and so on. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that makes sense. And then there are also particular differences why men and women start or initiate friendships with someone of the opposite sex, right? So, for example, much more men than women are interested in having a friendship with a woman,
right?
To try to have a short-term sexual relationship,
right?
Or even a one-night stand, right? And then in the case of women, they can start a friendship with a man to try to have another male to protect them.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's an indication, right, that you have these historical challenges, right, in our brains should have evolved to engage in various behaviors that would facilitate success under different conditions. And yeah, I mean, we see this striking sex difference in short-term willingness to engage in opportunistic sex and short-term mating strategies in general. And so if it is the case that when you mention just the opposite sex, men more so than women, what comes to their mind should be something of a sexual opportunity, because just even thinking about that would facilitate fruition of a short-term mating strategy. And in fact, in one of our more recent studies, we did just that. We asked men and women to think about an opposite sex friend. And we asked them to type out their initials or type their name And then as soon as they did that, the next slide came up and it said, what characterizes this person? Are they a friend of the opposite sex? Are they a person of the opposite sex who I'm attracted to? And then they could check both, right? So they were presented as boxes that you could check both. And men were more likely than women to select there's somebody I'm attracted to. Whereas the vast majority of women's responses were a friend of the opposite sex. So just this whole element of how they define it, or what's your mental imagery when a word comes to mind, may be different for men than for women. And it wouldn't, in my mind, be surprising if men and women have different sexual strategies constantly going in the background.
Okay, and are the main reasons for dissolution of friendships the fact that men and women, in the case of cross-sex friendships, don't get to fulfill these expectations even if they are completely subconscious?
Yeah, so even in, I guess what you're pointing to is the possibility that we get these sex differences from men and women when we're asking them to consciously report, like explicitly tell us, if this happened, would you end the friendship? If this happened, would you end the friendship? Or why did the friendship end? And even when you ask people to explicitly report, if your friend, if your friend really wasn't attracted to you, how likely is it that you would end the friendship? Men give higher rate. They don't give super high ratings, but they give higher ratings than women do to saying yes, they would end a friendship if there was no opportunity for sexual interaction, or the friend really wasn't attracted to them. And in fact, we find that men's reports of how attracted they think their friend is to them are correlated with their reports of having been engaged sexually with that friend, whereas their reports of how attracted they are to the friend are not. And so it's almost like if they have that opportunity or perceive that opportunity, they are more likely to take advantage of it. So I would say that there was something else I was going to tell you about in the context of what you asked, and now it flew away.
Okay, perhaps we'll keep going.
If
it comes back to your mind, you just say it.
Okay.
So do you think that the study of friendship dynamics in humans helps to clarify mating preferences for each sex?
I thought of what I was going to say. So let me tell you what I wanted to tell you, and then
sure.
We'll go back. It is that when you ask men and women if they have to some degree, if you have men and women feeling discrepant levels of attraction, and a lot of people will say, well, are you suggesting that men and women really need to talk about how they feel? Would that be good? They're looking for the applications, right, of these findings, and I'm kind of one of those people who I'm all about honest communication, and I'm relatively direct, and so I've always thought that it would seem like a good idea. And when so I asked men and women, have you and your friend talked about attraction in your friendship? And then we have also asked them, like, has your partner tried to act on attraction toward you? And when we ask men and women these questions, and they say yes, then we'll ask them, well, who started it? And women will say, he did. The majority of women will say, he did. He's the one who said something. He's the one who acted on it. And the men, about half of them will say, some of them will say, I did. But a good portion of them will say, we both did. So their perception of how the interactions have gone down, because we ask these questions for pairs of friends, so they're talking about the same friendship now. The male and the female don't quite agree on how things have gone down, right, in their friendship, which is also interesting, right, because you're trying to talk about like having communicating your intent, and yet there is disagreement about how that communication of intent has actually manifested, how it's actually happened in the relationship. So I think that's kind of a fun little blip on the radar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And then about the question of if the studying of the dynamics of human friendship would help clarify mating preferences. For...
Yeah, I think so. In other words, does friendship help us understand mate preferences? Well, to the extent that we see people look for the same types of characteristics in friends, not the same, not the exactly the identical, but certainly many of the same, particularly in opposite sex friendships, as they do when they're looking for a mate. It's kind of interesting, right? Your physical attractiveness is taking a priority, particularly for men. Young adult males, when we give them a limited budget and we say you can allot $0 to $10 to these 10 characteristics. If you give $10, you're putting, something else is going to have to give because there's only $50 and 10 characteristics. Their second highest will go to physical attractiveness, beat out only by faithfulness. And I think this falls along similar lines. Norm Lee has documented a similar kind of pattern, I believe, with limited mating budgets. And of course, I mentioned speed dating. I think those studies tend to pan out the same. And so my students and I talk about this a lot, doing a speed friending study. Speed friending in terms of same-sex friends would be interesting, but speed friending in terms of opposite-sex friends would be fascinating, because if the pattern of data was redundant with what you see in mating, speed dating studies, that would be yet one more piece of evidence suggesting that, yes, men's and women's mating strategies and their mate preferences seem to be operating in the context of their friendship selection. I would speculate that they would be nearly identical.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and because we're already touching a little bit on mate preferences and mate selection and things like that, I would like you to clarify some very specific thing, that is the question about how men pay attention to the waist to hip ratio of women when classifying them in terms of attractiveness. Because there are many people that when you talk about this with them, immediately say that, oh, but that must be untrue, because throughout history and in different historical periods, men preferred fatter women and then in others thinner women, right? So, but the waist to hip ratio has nothing to do with the size of the body. That is the body mass index, right? And you can have the same waist to hip ratio with different body sizes.
Sure. I mean, body mass index and waist hip ratio are correlated, but they're certainly not the same thing. And if you're interested in body shape, you definitely go after waist hip ratio, or just waist size, just waist circumference by itself, we know is a good indicator. And I would mention there are a few people who are really well versed in this literature to go to, like Steve Gollin or Aaron Lukaszewski. And they have given this a tremendous amount of thought. And it's not to say that there aren't historical, changes in body size and what being plump might reveal about your social status or access to resources. But I would argue, even within those times, if we had had the data, a plump 20-year-old, their body shape would look quite a bit different from a plump 50-year-old. And they may have similar body mass index, but their body shape would be different. One would be reproductively viable. And I'm surrounded by this. I mean, as a college instructor, I'm surrounded by women who are between 18 and 22, and they carry a lot more weight than I do, but their body shape makes it very clear that they are young and desirable, right? And I'm on the outs, and that's okay. I had my day, but the point is, right, body mass index is very different from waist hip ratio. And Dev Singh, in some of his research, looking at, and granted this is American centric, but looking at centerfolds over the course of 2 and 3 decades, showed that as the emphasis on thinness and just being, low BMI, as that emphasis increased, the centerfolds, they got lighter in weight, but their body shape there is clear consensus. 0.7 is still what you're seeing in those most desirable, or women who are essentially being used as the centerfolds because they are desirable. The 0.7 is pretty constant. Yeah. So I don't know. Did you want me to say more about that, or?
No, I think it's good enough, because I would also like to ask you to please talk a little bit about perhaps the most robust findings that we have in terms of the sex differences in the cues and signals that men and women pay attention to when selecting a mate of the opposite sex.
Yeah. Well, I think it's kind of interesting when you say men and women, because women are attending to so many things, right? And I think a lot of the attention, at least in terms of the physical, suggests that men are paying attention to cues of youth and vitality and reproductive viability. And what exactly are those? You've got the clear skin and you've got the energetic gait and all those types of things. But what do people observe just from one snapshot or one viewpoint of a woman? And I think there are a couple of research lines that I've been involved in that I think help get at that. And one is like, how important is the face as a snapshot as opposed to the body? And we know that there are a lot of cues in the face, because if you look at face as a predictor of full body attractiveness, and then body ratings as a predictor of full body, meaning face and body attractiveness, the face often carries quite a bit of weight. On the other hand, in a study where I put women in swimsuits, so their bodies are pretty exposed, then the body competes with the face as a close second in terms of variance accounted for in that full body attractiveness. But Dev Singh would say waist hip ratio, that was the magic bullet. But in fact, face alone is a very good predictor of full body attractiveness, and that suggests that there is a lot in the face. And so I would argue that symmetry is probably pretty huge.
But symmetry is huge for both sexes, right?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, for both sexes, and easily observed in the face, probably more easily observed in the face perhaps than other aspects of the body, just because you have these close-knit features. And with both men and women, you can look at distance between, the chin and the jawbone, or, the brow, all that, the angle of the brow, or the forehead. So many different elements to look at: the height of the cheekbones, how big the eyes are, and certainly I'm not one of those who's arguing that men are interested in infant-like features. There's a difference between infant features and reproductively viable features. Even capturing, blood flow to the face, that you see not pallid features, but skin tone that suggests health, right?
Yeah, but there's that thing about men preferring women with neotenous facial traits, right?
Yeah, but I don't know if they need to be called neotenous, but rather maybe youthful features. So, and I haven't seen this study, but I would argue that if you had a female who had baby features versus a female who had 18-year-old features, if you can somehow morph those, that males' preferences, I think about who is it, Ben Jones and Lisa De Bruin, if they ran some face studies and they were morphing the features to be very infant-like, that neoteny as opposed to more reproductive age for females, but what people find attractive, I'm guessing that people would prefer the reproductive age. So I think that's, to me, it's somewhat of a misnomer to say neotenous, because infants are not reproductively viable, and my guess is that male attention would not be focused in that direction. I do know that there's an interesting line of research, and I'm working with Steve Gullin and Aaron Lukaszewski to try to pinpoint these bodily features that are essentially redundant with ratings of attractiveness and perceptions of being nulliparous, essentially not yet having offspring, but being essentially reproductively ready. And so we are currently taking body measurements and photographs of women at various angles and women of varying ages. And the reason I wanted to get a hold of natural women is because so many of the studies out there today that track like what men pay attention to are studies that use digitally manipulated photos. So they'll show men pictures of women with breast sizes of, manipulated breast sizes, and then or manipulated waist circumference, and then they'll track how much attention men pay to different regions of the body. Fascinating research. But in the ecologically real environment, women with larger breasts do not generally have perky breasts, not until modern day and plastic surgery. But over our ecological history, breast size and BMI, waist size, those were correlated in ways that I think aren't necessarily accurately represented when we engage in digital manipulations of one body attribute at a time. And so we are essentially photographing and measuring women who are in various stages of their reproductive career, right? Some of them are 60 and have had multiple kids, and their body measurements and their measures of attractiveness, body measurements meaning waist-hip ratio, waist to stature ratio, waist circumference in general, those should be essentially redundant with perceptions of how many offspring they have had, and also their attractiveness, or what I say, lower rated attractiveness. That's what we're looking to hone in on.